In October 2015, I was in the 11th grade of high school. That was the time when I was completely immersed in an obsession with all things mystical and supernatural. I wasn't the type of kid who enjoyed partying or going out at night. I preferred spending time in my room reading scary stories, watching documentaries about haunted houses, and exploring internet forums filled with mysterious tales. Most of my nights back then were spent with headphones on and my dimly lit monitor glowing as I read stories from Ouija board users who claimed to have communicated with spirits or even darker entities. There was something about the uncertainty and fear that only made me more curious. As Halloween approached, I decided to buy a Ouija board online. I knew people said it was just a board game, or worse, an invitation to beings we don't understand. But the part of me that craved scary experiences won. I wanted to know if it really worked, or if it was all just a psychological trick. A few days later, the package arrived. The board looked ordinary, made of wood with alphabet letters, numbers, and the words yes, no, and goodbye. There was a small, lightweight planchette with a hole in the middle. That night, my parents were out attending a reunion, and the only ones home were me and my younger sister, who was 2 years younger than me. After convincing her, we sat at the dining table, lit a few small candles, and dimmed the lights. I knew it looked dramatic, but that was part of the fun. We placed our fingers on the planchette and started asking questions. Is there anyone with us tonight? If you are here, give us a sign. We laughed a few times because the atmosphere felt strange and a bit awkward. I playfully pushed the planchette a little, and my sister immediately smacked my arm, knowing it was me. After a few minutes, she started getting bored and complained that this was a waste of time. I said, let's try just a little longer. But still, nothing happened. The planchette remained still, and the spooky atmosphere I was hoping for never came. She finally gave up and went back to her room. Meanwhile, I became even more curious. I went back to my laptop and did more research. Many people said that beginners often failed on their first attempt. Some even suggested trying it alone late at night to create a stronger connection. I knew it sounded silly, but I felt like I had to try again. Around 1 in the morning, when the house was completely quiet, I went back down to the dining table, this time alone. I turned off all the lights except for one dim light in the kitchen. I sat down, placed my fingers on the planchette, and began asking, "Whoever is here, can you hear me? If there's a spirit here, give me a sign." Several minutes passed. No movement, no sound, just the ticking of the wall clock. Then, something changed. I heard a sound upstairs. Faint, like footsteps. Just 1 or 2 steps. At first, I thought my sister had woken up and was checking on me. But then I realized the sound was coming from my brother's room, which should be empty since he was away at college. I froze. Tried to listen more closely. Then another sound, whispers, a woman's voice, so soft, like a mumble. I slowly got up, stepped toward the stairs, and held my breath as I climbed them one by one. The closer I got to my brother's room, the clearer the voice became. I could hear a sentence repeated over and over, almost like a chant. "Grandma's coming, Joey. Grandma's coming, Joey." I froze. That wasn't my sister's voice. It wasn't anyone alive in the house. Because one thing came to my mind instantly. It was my grandmother's voice. She had passed away 2 years ago, and Joey, that was the nickname she used for me when I was little. My hand trembled as I turned the doorknob. When I flipped on the light, the room was empty. There was no one there. The voice vanished instantly. I don't remember how I got back downstairs, but what I do remember is locking myself in my room and hiding under the blanket like a scared little kid. I tried to pray, repeating prayers I hadn't said in years, but that night I didn't sleep. I just laid there staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had opened something that should have stayed closed. To this day, I've never touched that Ouija board again. I kept it in the storage room and tried to forget it existed. But what I can never forget is that voice, my grandmother's voice, coming from an empty room. I used a spirit board for the first time in my mid-20s. Before that, I'd never been interested in the supernatural, but that night, a friend invited me to an abandoned house with two women who he said were into paranormal activities. One of them brought a Ouija board and some other items like candles. They planned to hold some kind of spirit summoning session in the long-abandoned house. I went along because I had no other plans that night, and they said it was just for fun. The drive to the house took about half an hour. We stopped in front of an old gate, overgrown with weeds, and walked down a dark path toward the back of the house. We entered through a broken window. Inside, the house felt frozen in time. The furniture was still intact, though much of it had rotted with age. The wooden floor creaked under every step. Old photographs hung on the walls, showing unfamiliar faces from another era. The air was cold and stale. I'm not someone who scares easily, but something about that house made me keep looking over my shoulder. The Ouija board was placed on the living room floor. The candles were lit, casting a soft, flickering light. When the board began to move, they all looked very serious. The first name that appeared was Gregory. Supposedly, he had died 3 decades ago. I thought it was just a game. They were probably moving the board without realizing it, or maybe even on purpose. But then a loud thud echoed from the upper floor. The entire house seemed to shake for a moment. We all froze. Seconds later, we heard footsteps, slow and heavy, moving across the upper floor. The sound was unmistakably real, too real to ignore. We decided to go upstairs. The wooden staircase nearly collapsed with every step. In one of the bedrooms, we found an old wardrobe with the door slightly open. From inside, we could hear heavy breathing. There was no rational explanation. No animal could breathe that loudly and rhythmically. We backed away and hurried downstairs, but the room where we had been, the one with the Ouija board and candles, was now empty. Everything they had brought was gone. We got out of the house as quickly as we could. The night felt much darker than before. We tried calling them, but there was no answer. Their numbers kept going to voicemail, even days afterward. To this day, I still don't know what really happened that night. Maybe it was all part of an elaborate prank meant to scare us. Or maybe we actually made contact with something not entirely dead. Something still inside that house, waiting and listening. I first heard about the Ouija board when I was 15. I never took it seriously. It was just something people played with in horror stories. But when my cousin Daniel told me he found an old Ouija board that belonged to our grandfather in his attic, I was intrigued and wanted to try it. We made plans to use it on Saturday night, when my house would be empty because my parents were attending a distant relative's wedding. I invited Daniel and our 2 friends, Michael and Sarah, to come over. When they arrived, we took the board down to the basement, the darkest and quietest place in the house. We lit some candles around the board and sat cross-legged on the floor, each of us placing a finger on the planchette. I tried not to laugh as Michael whispered in a spooky voice, "If there's a spirit here, give us a sign." We all held our breath, waiting for something to happen. The planchette began to move, slowly but surely. I chuckled, thinking one of them was messing around. "Who's moving it?" I asked. They all swore they weren't. Sarah, now looking more serious, asked, "What's your name?" The planchette slid over the letters, spelling T-O-M-A-S. We exchanged glances. None of us knew anyone by that name. I asked, "How did you die?" F-I-R-E. Suddenly the candle to my right went out on its own. I got chills. There was no wind and no open windows. Michael tried to act cool and said, "Let's ask something creepier." I gathered my courage and asked, "Tomas, are you here with us now?" The planchette quickly moved to yes. At that exact moment, the basement lights flickered and then went out. We all froze, the only light coming from the candles. I could feel my heart pounding. Michael laughed nervously. "Okay, who's screwing around?" "I don't like this," Sarah said, pulling her hand away from the board. We decided to end the session and say goodbye, just like the rules said we should. But before we could, something fell from the shelf behind us. A wooden box hit the ground and spilled open. Daniel walked over and picked up an old photo from inside. "Oh my God, it's Grandpa when he was young," he muttered. But there was something more disturbing. Behind our grandfather stood a shadowy figure of a man staring directly at the camera with hollow eyes. We quickly closed the Ouija board, blew out the candles, and ran upstairs. I locked the basement door and swore I'd never go down there alone again. That night I tried to sleep, but just before I drifted off, I heard footsteps downstairs. I held my breath and listened closely. The steps moved from the living room toward the stairs. I shut my eyes tightly, hoping it was just my imagination. But then, my bedroom door creaked open slightly. I froze. I told myself it might be the wind, but how? All the windows were closed. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I pointed it toward the door, but there was nothing there. It was open just a few inches. I got up, slowly walked over, and gently closed it. I got back into bed, trying to shake the fear, but as I lay down, I heard a whisper, a soft whisper coming from inside the closet. I froze. No one else was in the house except Daniel, who was sleeping in the guest room. I gathered my courage, walked to the closet, and opened it. There was nothing there, but the air inside was colder than the rest of the room. I shut the closet quickly and jumped back into bed, pulling the blanket over my head. I didn't dare close my eyes. I waited, heart pounding. Suddenly, I heard something fall from the nightstand. I reached out to turn on the lamp, and when the light came on, the Ouija board was lying on the floor next to my bed. I froze, my body shaking. I knew I had returned that board to its box and left it in the basement. There was no way it could be here again. I woke Daniel up and showed him the board. He was just as shocked as I was. We decided to get rid of it, taking it outside and throwing it in the trash bin in the backyard. But the next morning, when I went out to check if it was still there, the board was gone. I never found out what happened to that Ouija board after that, but I never played again. Every night since then, I still feel like something is watching me from the darkness of my room. And I always make sure the closet door is tightly shut before I go to sleep.